trying, by the grace of God, to show you how close we are to this major deception. If you'll turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and if you'll notice what the apostle's talking about here, he says in verse number 7, "The mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let be taken out of the way." The mystery of iniquity is set in contradistinction to the mystery of God. The incarnation is the mystery of God as far as we know it right now. That is, that God the Father incarnated himself through the Son in a human flesh, in a human body. And so there the Lord Jesus Christ is the manifestation, the incarnation of God in flesh. And the Trinity, therefore, was bound up in the Son of God, because the Bible said in him dwelleth the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And the apostle says that in the book of Colossians. The fullness, the pleroma of the Godhead bodily. Apostle Paul used a word that the Gnostics have perverted and twisted to their own purposes down through the centuries and still do. Pleroma means the fullness, that means the full manifestation, the fullness in the sense that all of this cosmic bubble has manifested itself in something or someone. Now, the Antichrist, when he shows up, I believe he's alive right now, but when he shows up, he's going to be the incarnation of Satan in flesh, after he has received a deadly wound, Revelation 13, and literally raised from the dead. It is that resurrection from the dead that is the foundation for the great deception that falls upon humanity. So I want to bring some stuff for you this morning. This is heavy now, okay? Just buckle up. And I believe you can handle what I'm going to say. Some of this stuff is strong. We live in a generation today, you know, they call a lot of people snowflakes. And the reason they call them snowflakes is because they have been brainwashed by their professors out here in these colleges into believing that they can live and they can create their own world and their own existence, that they can exempt themselves from anything that might offend them. And I have to tell you this morning, you're going to be offended. You're going to hear people say things that will offend you. I hear people say things about the Lord Jesus all the time that offends me. But it doesn't matter to these people. You see, they're the only ones that can be offended, not us. That's the way they think. But I've told you how important that Darwinism, the idea of evolution, is to the mindset of the elite of the system that's going to control this world. Believe me, folks, the elite, the movers and the shakers, the ones who are in the shadow government, they're talking about the deep state. You hear all of this all the time. These people are very religious. Their religion is Luciferianism, but we've got to lay the foundation for it this morning in the lesson for you to understand what I'm talking about. Now, how many of you know exactly who I'm talking about when I mention Charles Darwin? Now, Charles Darwin published a work in the 1800s, and here's the title of his work: The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, now listen carefully, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, how many of you have never heard that second part to the title of The Origin of the Species? Well, that's the full title. The reason you don't hear the full title is because it's a very revealing thing. The preservation, now listen carefully to the wording, of favored races in the struggle for life. And I'm going to make a big statement here. Charles Darwin was a racist to the bone. And evolution, the doctrine of evolution, is built on the premise of racism. The people that throw the word around today, and they use it to where it's become, it doesn't have any meaning anymore, but the elite have titles and labels that they want to control you by. And one of them is racist. Now, once you're branded a racist, then you are cut off a lot of times from your employment. You're cut off from your family members or your friends. You're cut off. You're stigmatized from then on for the rest of your life. So all they have to do is brand you a racist and make it stick. And once they've done that, you're finished, because you can't even get employment. Don't you think it's quite remarkable that the people who subscribe, and most of them do, to the doctrine of evolution, don't you think it's quite remarkable that the people who throw these labels around and racism and all this are the worst racist that ever lived? Now, if, you know, and I don't know who's listening to this, but if you are an evolutionist, I challenge you, I dare you to dig into the stuff that I'm going to mention today, and then for your own intellectual honesty, face what I'm going to talk about. And then it's going to lead you somewhere. There's a point in this, not just to indict this thing, but there's a purpose in it. Like the old boy said, if it doesn't make any sense, somebody's making money from it. All right, that's the way things work. Eric Lyons, master of ministry, Kyle Butt, these two men, wrote this article about Darwin, evolution, and racism. Now, I've told you before that the idea of evolution is based on the premise that there's some kind of a life force that's at work, developing, evolving the creatures that we understand, that we deal with on a daily basis, including you, the biological evolution. They continue with it, they make it social evolution. They've continued with it, and now it is spiritual evolution. So you have biological evolution, social evolution, and spiritual evolution. All three of these make up the whole body of what we call evolution. And I'll show you how this works. I'm going to read you a segment from their work. It won't take but a minute, but listen carefully as I read this. In February the 12th, 2009, a debate between Dan Barker and Kyle Butt. 1 minute and 30 seconds into his rebuttal speech, Kyle pointed out that Adolf Hitler was attempting to breed a superior Aryan race of humans. He suggested that this plan fit perfectly with Darwin's understanding of natural selection, especially in light of Darwin's subtitle to his major work, The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. In short, Kyle suggested that Darwin thought some races of humans were evolutionarily superior to others, and this idea led Hitler to attempt to eliminate those he deemed to be inferior. In Barker's 5-minute closing arguments, he addressed this idea and stated, quote, now listen carefully, this is their position. They like to parse words. When Darwin talked about favored races, in those days, the word race did not mean human race like Hitler might have used it. In his day, the word race was just a synonym for animal species. He wasn't talking about favored races like whites over blacks or something, unquote. According to Barker, Darwin did not make a distinction between various human races, but simply between the human race and animal races. Barker's statement was not backed by any documented definition from Darwin or his contemporaries, and in truth is patently false. Darwin did distinguish between various human races or species of men, and he believed that some were superior to others. Although he steered clear of these ideas, now listen carefully, in The Origin of Species, his second major work on evolutionary theory, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, published 1871, did address the issue. Darwin began the first chapter of The Descent of Man with these words, quote, he who wishes to decide whether man is the modified descendant of some pre-existing form would probably first inquire whether man varies, however slightly, in bodily structure and in mental faculties, and if so, whether the variations are transmitted to his offspring in accordance with the laws which prevail with the lower animals, unquote. Later in his chapter titled On the Affinities and Genealogy of Man, Darwin wrote, listen carefully, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. So what did he say? He said this. He said through the process of evolution, that this ape that apparently is closest to man in the evolutionary scale will be moved so far apart that man will break from that and his evolution will purify or be more purified in its process. Now, clearly Darwin was convinced that the more civilized races, Caucasian, would one day exterminate the more savage races, which he considered to be less evolved and thus more ape-like than Caucasians. Darwin believed that the Negro and Australian are more of a subspecies, somewhere between Caucasians and apes. Note, in addition to Darwin's racist comments in The Descent of Man, he also included sexist statements his evolutionary views led him to believe that the chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can woman, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of the senses and hands. The average of mental power in man must be above that of a woman. Man has ultimately become superior to woman. That's heavy stuff. Now, I don't want to misrepresent Charles Darwin, but I want this patronizing, condescending, holier than thou, highbrow crowd that gets up in their classrooms week after week teaching your kids the evolutionary theory of Darwin. I want them to come face to face with the full import of what they're about. Instead of hiding behind their lies and cutting the title of that book in half, you're going to have to swallow it all. And all of it includes that if you accept what Darwin taught, then you believe that the white man and the Caucasian is vastly superior to a black man. Because that's what he just said. This is documented. This is taken from his book. Now, believe me, I've spent hours this week in researching this material. Darwin's defenders, his apologists, will come along and say, now wait a minute, you're just taking an excerpt from one book to get a broader view of what Darwin taught. We need to bring into what some of the other things that he said here, said there, said here, and said there. Who knows what evolved in Darwin's mind as it related to any of this? But I'm telling you what he said in his book right here when it was written, and that's what counts. But my greater point is this. My greater point is not so much Darwin. Darwin's gone. He's gone out to meet his maker, like we all do. The greater point is the hypocrisy that they're using on people today. And that hypocrisy runs so deep that it's unbelievable. To teach your children, they cherry pick what they want to from this. Now, I've told you before about eugenics and sterilization, haven't I? How many of you remember me talking about eugenics? I mean, I've mentioned it time and time and time again. Eugenics is the so-called scientific outgrowth of Darwinism, where through breeding, you can breed out characteristics you don't want and breed in the characteristics you do want. And sterilization is where the states themselves, passed laws. And these laws, you can check them out on their books, passed laws that certain people would be sterilized so that they could not have children. This progressed all the way into the 1970s. You can go back and you can read articles written by college professors in the 20s and the 30s. The college professors in the 20s and the 30s defending Darwin and defending what he's talking about here in this racial thing. This is as racist as it gets, folks. Defending this stuff. You can read the articles that they wrote defending this, and you can see how that this definitely laid the foundation for Adolf Hitler and what he did. He just simply took it and took it to its end.